What I'd like to move on to now is a little bit, we've talked about the diagnostic criteria, we've talked about that in quite a bit of detail. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about how we make these diagnoses, what instruments and assessment approaches that we use. And there are kind of three broad areas that we use when we're making assessments. The first one is just clinical interview, and that's exactly what many of you have probably engaged in and seen done in a number of different places and settings. This is interviewing parents, getting background information, doing records reviews, and so on to look at what the person's history has been like. Okay, so that's not significantly different. It's also talking about what different things that we see. A lot of times, however, the different components of autistic disorder can be somewhat subtle and difficult to recognize, particularly if you're talking about kids or adults who aren't severely affected. And we have a couple of other things that we do in terms of making those assessments. And as I go into this, one of the things I'll mention, the gentleman asked me this question, and I want to make sure that I'm clear about this. When we talk about the diagnostic criteria and the fact that symptoms are present before 3 years of age for a lot of these disorders, the question was, so you're usually assessing them at 2 or 3 years of age? And the answer is no. Most often, we are assessing children or adults who are considerably older than that, where parents have gone through a number of other avenues to look for help and now are saying, okay, I learned about autism, I've been hearing about it in the news, and a lot of things that they describe sounds like it could be my son or daughter, or they have heard about it from school and so on, and we are going back and establishing that age of onset as well as doing our other assessments. It is not uncommon for me to see people coming into adult programs in their 20s, 30s, and older with undiagnosed autism. So what we're talking about here, most of it will apply across the age spectrum. Okay? So one of the things that's going to happen with just about everybody as we're doing assessments is that we're going to be doing a clinical interview as we would with anybody else. But from there, it's important to be aware that there are a number of different screening instruments and rating scales available of greater and lesser quality. I've listed some common ones here, and I'll talk about them very, very briefly. Probably the one that's been around at least the longest as far as my recollection is the Childhood Autism Rating Scale. It's now in its second iteration. This is widely available. It's inexpensive. There is some degree of you get what you pay for with it. But it's easy to use, easy to administer, and it's inexpensive. Now, it's only good for kids, not good for adults. There are the Gilliam scales, both for autism and Asperger's. These are again in their second generation, the autism rating scale is. This is again a screening instrument. You're asking parents or the person some questions, maybe a teacher, and getting information again, simple and easy to administer, get a quick answer to tell you. These are going to be good primarily for telling you if you're on the right track, if autism is something that that you should be thinking about. And there are a lot of others. I'm going to talk about this one in a little bit more detail. There are a lot of others that meet this same description, where they're good, quick screening instruments that will give you some information, tell you if this is a direction that maybe you should be looking in. Another one that you may come across is the Autism Diagnostic Interview, the ADI. It's on here because it's a rating scale and diagnostic interview. It is not a screening instrument. This thing takes 45 minutes to an hour and a half to administer. And it's a lot of extremely detailed information on the child's behavior. It is research tested and shown to be pretty good at picking out symptoms of autism. It doesn't get used a lot because it takes 45 minutes to an hour and a half to administer. And it is something that parents, in my experience, find very tedious to participate in, because it seems like you're answering the same questions over and over again, which I think is partly a byproduct of getting the statistical qualities that the test needs to be considered a good screening instrument. This is often a starting, these items are often a starting place to tell you again if you're on the right track. So in terms of doing assessment, often we'll start with a clinical interview. we'll go through and get background information, and we may administer something like this to help us decide whether we're going to proceed with the next components of the evaluation. And from there, ideally what we want to be doing is a direct assessment. I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, or the ADOS. If you've been working in the field with children and adults who have autism for any length of time, you may have heard about this. The ADOS is the only instrument of its kind that I'm aware of, the only direct assessment specifically for autism spectrum disorders. So I won't be going through a list of other ones because this is all that we have. And what this is an instrument that directly assesses for symptoms. And we're taking children or adults and putting them in a variety of semi-structured, primarily social interactions. We're going through those interactions and we're looking for very specific types of responses. A lot of them are play and conversational interactions, sometimes about current events. For kids, it can be, there are components of it where we're looking through and we're reading stories together, and what we're looking for is specific bits about how they respond. So that, you know, if you're sitting and reading a story and you talk about what's going on with this character in the story, a typically functioning 8-year-old will tell you a lot, can tell you a lot about what it seems like has happened up to that point, what the person's thinking, what they're feeling. A lot of the people that we assess will tell you things about the picture, what the details are. The boy's wearing a red shirt. It's cloudy. It's not about the other components of what are going on. When we do our social interactions, we're going to be evaluating the emotional component. We're going to be evaluating the ability of the other person to take our perspective. Part of that often involves the evaluator giving some very basic information about themselves and seeing if there's any reciprocal social interaction and so on. These take about 45 minutes to an hour to do, and right now they're considered the gold standard for autism assessment. What it does is removes a lot of the guesswork about the things that you'd otherwise be trying to suss out with parents and with the person to sort out if they're actually showing these things. It can be challenging, both, particularly for kids, but also with adults when they come in and interact with you. If you have a person who is higher functioning, a lot of times in a brief interactive session where you are asking questions and they are answering them, they can do quite well. And a lot of kids in particular do very well in a clinical interview because they're accustomed to talking to adults, because the adults are the ones that talk to them. This lets you get at the rest of that social picture so you can see what's going on, and ends up with a pretty unambiguous score that tells you whether they should be considered for an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis or not. The developer of this, her name is Catherine Lord, has been in the process for some time for developing a version of this that looks at the behavior of infants to see if we can detect autism earlier. A lot of this has to do with comparing social interaction for typically developing infants against others. So these are things like how often they regard an adult's face, a parent's face, how they respond to real typical social interactions from the parents. You know, you get a baby, they're cute, you talk to them, you gurgle. Well, some kids are very interested in that, and a few, often kids on the spectrum, don't want to have anything to do with that, don't respond positively to those social overtures and so on. That's been in development for at least the last 5 years. A lot of us are waiting to see it, in part because when we start to talk about interventions, the earlier we can do it, the more effective we are. And so if we can identify this earlier on, and a lot of times we see these things when we're doing diagnostics and you talk with parents, especially if it's a first child, parents may not recognize it because they don't have a lot of experience with other infants, but family members will say. Grandparents, for example, that the child was different than they remember their kids being. Brothers and sisters who have already had kids will tell us that. So this is a way to directly assess and pick up on symptoms of autism. Has anybody ever seen this done? We have far too few people who know how to do it. It is something that is an assessment that, if you like working with children and adults, can be a lot of fun to administer. A lot of it is play-based. You're looking for something specific, but the kid doesn't know that. I recommend looking into it if it's something that, if an area that interests you. With these diagnostics, we will also look at, just so you're aware as we go through and we do a comprehensive diagnosis, we'll do these components. And when we do a comprehensive evaluation, we also often will include a level of functioning evaluation. That's going to be things like IQ testing and adaptive skill testing. We will include often speech evaluations and occupational therapy evaluations as well. Usually at the point that a parent is coming in and starting to talk about things like this, there's enough going on that a comprehensive picture is going to tell us better what we're going to be needing to focus on for treatment. So those aren't necessary to diagnose autism proper, but they are often a component of the evaluations that we do. And with all of this, and the things that you hear in the news, probably you are familiar with the idea that autism, the diagnosis of autism, has been increasing. This is something that shows up quite a bit. In the 1960s and 80s, we saw about 0.5%, 5 in 10,000 diagnosed. That's come up considerably over the past 40 years. So that now, most recently, we see a rate reported of 1 in 100. And there have been a lot of questions about why this is. A lot of speculation, a lot of theories and hypotheses about why this is happening. What I'd like to do for the next few minutes is to give you folks some background information on what has been happening around the diagnosis of autism and how it's counted, to give you a better picture of what this information represents. There are a lot of issues with how we count, how we determine prevalence, particularly for autism. This is true for some other diagnoses as well, but in particular for this issue. And it's important to be aware as we talk about those numbers that there are a number of things that have been happening over those past 40 years that enter into what we're talking about when we talk about autism. The first is that there have been significant changes in diagnostic criteria since the disorder was first described. We've made significant changes in the way that we measure how many people have the disorder. And there's been a general increase in awareness for a number of different reasons, which we'll talk about. First, let's talk about the diagnostic criteria. I'm sure you all recognize this gentleman. Probably not. His name's Leo Kanner. His name is spelled K-A-N-N-E-R, but the internet assures me it's pronounced Connor. And he is the first person to have described autistic disorder. And most of what he described fits that classic autistic disorder diagnosis, the first one we talked about. And he described it back in 1943. So that really is the first place that we see him putting together this information. Has anybody heard the term refrigerator mothers? Familiar with this? This is the gentleman that started that. So maybe look at his picture a little differently now. But he's the first person to describe it. He put out a paper in 1943 that described a series of children with and the symptoms that he was seeing, and identified them as having components that, while somewhat different in presentation from person to person, really represented the same overarching thing from one person to the next. But while he described it back in 1943, he didn't provide a specific diagnostic criteria. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, didn't come out until 1952, and it actually came out in part as an answer to this problem. A lot of papers, a lot of people describing different conditions, but the descriptions, as it was for this gentleman, were very literate. Lots of ongoing and often wonderful prose about what it looked like and what they'd experienced and so on. And if you were a good reader, you could read it and see when somebody else sort of looked like this. But it wasn't the hard, specific criteria that we talk about nowadays. You had to kind of have read the paper and had gotten the picture of what he was talking about to see what was going on. And that was true for a number of diagnoses, in fact, back in the 1930s and 40s. That's actually part of the reason the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual came out, because until it did, there were a lot of problems with regional diagnoses, where people who looked very much the same in Ohio might be diagnosed with bipolar disorder, for example, and people who looked just like them but in New York City might be called schizophrenic, for example. A lot of it based on what different papers the doctors had read and so on. Okay. So we really didn't have any hard information until the DSM came out, and we're going to talk about that here in a second, because there's been many adjustments over the years since that initial categorization. The first two editions of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which came out in '52 and '68, don't include autistic disorder at all. They both include very brief references to autism, the symptoms of autism, as being a symptom of childhood schizophrenia. And we will actually periodically go through with older adults and find that back in their childhood years, they were diagnosed with childhood schizophrenia. And a lot of times when we see that, the person standing in front of us, who is 48, 50 years old, clearly has autism. And this was the only way to categorize it when they were first recognized. That can cause other problems, because oftentimes we'll see them being treated as adults for schizophrenia and not terribly successfully, because folks didn't understand the shift. But here, for the first two editions of this, up through 1968 and in fact through 1980, it doesn't appear as a diagnosis at all. With the DSM-3, we finally get an actual diagnosis. If you consider this against the backdrop of when it starts to appear and rise in frequency, these match pretty well. The DSM-3 includes what they call infantile autism. It also included PDD-NOS, which we still have now, much with similar descriptions, but they were very specific. There wasn't much wiggle room. You either met the criteria or you did not. In particular, it did not include the, pick two from here, one from here, one from here. You meet this or you don't. It's very specific. In 1987, the DSM-3R comes out. The name gets changed to autistic disorder. We still have autistic disorder and pervasive developmental disorders, and the description, the diagnostic criteria, got significantly broader. So more people fall under this diagnosis starting in 1987 than fell under it before. And then after that, in 1994, we get the DSM-4 and the DSM-4-TR in 2000. And folks aware that when we talk about the DSM-4-TR, the reason it's called TR, it's a text revision. The diagnostic criteria didn't change. It's the information in the manual around it, because somebody suddenly realized it had been 6 years since anybody had updated that, and maybe there were some changes. Well, we go from having two diagnostic categories that are relatively specific in 1980 to, in 1994, having 5 diagnostic categories. And it's important to realize that nothing like Asperger's disorder in particular really shows up in the DSM until this point. Where here you have good verbal skills, but some social deficits, no adaptive deficits, no IQ challenges, none of that here. Also, the diagnostic criteria for PDD-NOS are quite broad in our current version. Got some features of it. We'll call it PDD-NOS. Don't have to be terribly specific. You see how that changes over time. So we have broadened our diagnostic categories considerably from the first description to what we're talking about today. Leo Kanner probably wouldn't recognize some of the kids that we say have autism spectrum disorder as being similar to the group that he had without some real close investigation, because he was really talking about this. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Hmm?
Somebody without a specialization in this giving a diagnosis. Because I know for me, I'm always a lot more comfortable giving a diagnosis and keeping it in once if I see it, and then I refer them to like a psychologist to do really specific testing. Is that good practice? Should I be doing more of it myself?
Well, I think it's good practice for anybody doing clinical work, if you are not 100% comfortable with what you're doing, to refer to the person that you think will be more comfortable with it. So I think that's appropriate in general. In particular, when you get into Asperger's disorder and PDD-NOS, the different components of it can be more subtle and more difficult to detect. And we do have, just in terms of general diagnosis, we have a diagnostic feature called a rule-out that works quite nicely for that, where you're saying, I think it might be this. Could you please tell me if it is or not, right? That's what that's for, and that's a very appropriate way to use it. This is probably what we'll spend most of our time for this section on. Changes in measurement approaches. One of the key difficulties to how this works and is presented in terms of how many people have it is that we have not been counting the same things over time. Okay, so when we have those older numbers based on where we're talking about 5 children in 10,000 and 50 children in 10,000, those numbers are actually primarily based on state-by-state special education qualification reporting. What I mean by that is states are required to report how many children are receiving special education services based on a specific qualification of fill in the category here. And so a lot of the older numbers count the number of children in a given state receiving special education services for an autism classification. Those of you who do some work with children, has there been any change in the rate of autism classification for special education that you've seen? Why does that change over time? Any thoughts on that? Often, there are differences for different school districts and systems in terms of what they get better funding rates for in terms of the different qualifications. For quite some time, many school districts got a better funding rate for mental impairment or mental retardation than they did for autism if they had a qualification for autism. So if your child met both, you give them one, you're going to go with the one that pays better. For many school districts over the past 5 to 8 years, there have been changes where that's been reversed. And in fact, if you look at the numbers, the rate of qualification for mental retardation or mental impairment goes down as the rate for autism qualification goes up. Okay? What's also important to realize about this is that a special education qualification does not equal a diagnosis. The school psychologist and special education team is not diagnosing the child when they qualify them for special education. That's often very hard for parents to understand. It's actually hard for a lot of practitioners to understand that just because a child receives special education services on a specific qualification does not automatically have different criteria for those qualifications than we may have to make a diagnosis. So we're counting something here from state to state that is not the same as what we're talking about when we talk about prevalence. But those are the numbers we're using, and it's changing over time. And all of these numbers are measurements on children, because they're all coming from the schools. Last winter, the CDC reported a study out of the Journal of Pediatrics that did a more direct measure of the rate of autism, and they did it much more specifically than what we're talking about. They changed the way they're measuring it. What they did was did telephone surveys of parents of 78,000 people. And the reason I'm kind of pausing on that is because that's a huge study. Most research, when you do it, you're lucky to get 100, 200 people participating. This is a massive number of participants. So they did phone surveys of parents, 78,000 children. The children were 3 to 17 years of age. Okay? And they asked a couple of key questions. They asked more questions than this, but the key questions were whether a doctor or health care provider had ever identified their child as having an autism spectrum disorder. Not a school, not a special education qualification, somebody who can actually provide a diagnosis. Had it ever been done, and if so, was the child currently diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder? And if the answer to both of those was yes, they were counted as being a person with an autism spectrum disorder. This study is where that new number comes from, the 1 in 100. So what's important to realize here is that until this was done, nobody's ever counted it directly in this way. Everything else was estimates based on other pieces of information. So the type of information that goes into that 1 in 100 is quite a bit different than the way that we were looking at it before. It doesn't answer one question, which is the question of adults. And it's difficult to describe the rate of a condition rising if we don't know what it looks like in adults in general. And we did not know at all how many adults had this condition. The overwhelming majority of research is done on children. The funding for research often is focused on children. We don't know, when we're talking about people over the age of 18 or 22, how many people in the general population have the condition, or didn't know, which we'll talk about here in a second. The reason that I bring that up, and the reason that it is important if you think about this, is that if you're talking about a condition increasing in frequency, it's one thing to compare it to kids from 5 years ago with more kids. But if it's increasing in frequency, wouldn't the number of kids being assessed need to be higher than the people who are adults who have it? Does that make sense the way that I'm saying it? Right? And the simple truth of the matter is, we didn't know the answer to that. So the assumption was that these numbers were higher than what we would see for adults. At almost exactly the same time as the CDC released the results of their study out of pediatrics, the National Health Service, which is kind of the Great Britain's version of the CDC, released a very similar study. Really got overshadowed in this country, both because we don't pay a lot of attention to news from other countries and because the CDC study came out at the same time. They did a very similar study, but they looked at 7,000 adults in Great Britain. Again, not as big as the CDC study, but this is a huge number. 7,000 people in a very small country. 7,000 people. They did phone survey questions very similar to the ones in the CDC study, asking very similar questions. Have you ever been diagnosed? Are you currently diagnosed? But then an additional component that they did, which is actually even better than the CDC study, was they identified a subset of the people that they called and actually went out and did the ADOS on them. And the purpose of this was to validate the results of the phone study. So if we go out and we directly assess a sample of these folks, will they turn out to have autism when they reported that they have autism? And it held. And the rate they arrived at among adults was 1 in 100. So what they found among the adults was the same number as we found here in this country among children. These were both released in 2007, so it's pretty new information. It's real hard to see here because of the amount of light, but I typically will post these online, and there's a link to the study at the end as well. I thought the CDC study was very good, but this study I was actually more excited about and more interested in because while I do a fair amount of work with kids now, the bulk of my early work with folks with autism has been with adults. I've mentioned a couple of times that we would see people come in not having been diagnosed and diagnose them again. This is not at all uncommon for our experience. We would see folks come in not having been diagnosed, and a lot of the difficulties we were dealing with them, the reason that they were coming into more intensive settings was because they were having difficulties that go along with autism that other people didn't recognize and didn't know how to treat. And even retrospectively, when I was just doing case management and that kind of work, I can look back and picture several people that, knowing now what I didn't know then, I realize had autism and weren't diagnosed. It does not surprise me that we're finding that these rates are much higher than we thought. Now, that's my personal experience, not a scientific study, but it's always very, very cool when somebody does science and it supports what you already believed, right? So what this tells us is it's been around for a while, and if we count it the same way across multiple populations, we find that this is about the number we're at. Also means that based on the way that we're counting it, it's not quite as rare as we once thought it was. It starts to look more like the prevalence rates of other disorders like depression and schizophrenia and so on. The other area that we see is an increase in general public awareness. Who remembers this movie? Right? How many of you had even heard of autism before it came out? Right? I hadn't. You had? This is Temple Grandin. She's been going around for the past couple of decades talking about autism and what it looks like. Just had a movie come out about her life. We are seeing more and more information about this, and there have been a number of different organizations come together to increase our education level. Professionals are more aware of this condition, and it's gotten to the point now where it's a common enough thing. Who knows who this guy is? It is Sheldon. Who knows that Sheldon probably has Asperger's disorder? They never mention it on the show, at least not through season 2. I'm watching it on DVD. But for example, somebody mentions something, Sheldon thinks of a fact, and he must tell everybody at the table about the fact. If they interrupt him, he lets them speak, and when they're done, he continues to explain the fact. Do they care what Sheldon is talking about? They're not interested in the fact. Does he recognize that or even care? No. One of my favorite moments is actually a moment where they purposely continually interrupt him, and you see him twitching, and he's got to finish, and then when he finally does, he gets the whole thing out in a hurry, takes a drink, and reminds them that they promised never to do that again. Right? He has very particular habits and routines that must be completed in a specific way. He has specific spaces that he sits in the house and other people aren't allowed to be in. And he has extremely understanding friends who tolerate these things. One of my favorite lines is they're going to a conference in San Francisco, I think, and they mention that they're going by train. Well, how'd you decide to go by train? Well, we took a vote, and 3 of us voted to take a plane, and Sheldon said we should take a train, so we're taking a train. They board the train, and he has, from the moment he walks in, he's explaining to them what type of car they're in, when it was manufactured, how many seats it has, which part of the train they have to sit in, because it will provide the optimal amount of cushioning in terms of the suspension, which is the point at which Leonard interrupts him and says, Sheldon, you've said 9,000 words and been on the train for 5 minutes. Just tell me where to sit. Okay? We have gotten to a point of understanding of this disorder that we can now recognize it in terms of day-to-day life and even have a little bit of fun with it. I think, you know, and people go back and forth in terms of how they feel about it, but I think it's actually a wonderful example because he's a very capable person. He's got a lot of exceptional skills, but nobody apologizes or covers over those deficits either. It's a pretty honest portrayal of somebody who probably meets the criteria for Asperger's and is also exceptionally bright. So not everybody with Asperger's looks like this, but a lot of those components are a part of it. We know a lot more about this. When the DSM-IV first came out, psychiatrists and other physicians were encouraged through the training on the new diagnostic structure to recognize, identify, and diagnose, because we have folks who are having these difficulties. There are treatments available. Let's recognize it and get it in the lexicon. Do these different changes account for all of the increase? We don't know. But I want to make sure you have that backdrop of information in order to evaluate those increases in numbers against the other things that we hear about them. Other questions about this? About all of it, in terms of the changing numbers over time?
How did the vaccination expand?
Well, that's a good question. I purposely didn't include that. We'll talk about it, but I purposely didn't include that because that's not really my goal here. How does the vaccination piece get mixed into all of this? Study was done several years ago. I don't have the exact numbers. I didn't write them down. By a gentleman named Wakefield, looking at a correlation between increased use of the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine and recognition of autistic disorder, the rising rate of autistic disorder. And this correlation was taken to mean in the literature that the MMR was causing autism. And there are a lot of components of that that occur in coincidence that make it understandable why people would at least consider looking at it that way. The age at which the MMR is given is very similar in time frame to the age at which we typically first start to detect symptoms of this disorder. You know, we're giving vaccinations. Your child seems to be acting differently than you expect. You look for reasons. Well, here's a reason. And that increasing time frame corresponds nicely to the increased use of the vaccine. Now, there have been several subsequent studies and evaluations of Wakefield's original paper. The subsequent evaluations suggest that his research methodology was not very good. The Lancet, which originally published it in Britain, has retracted the paper, and subsequent direct analyses don't find the same relationship that he found. But it lives on. And part of the reason I do the rest of the talk here is because there's a lot of other things going on that also speak to that rise in number. All right. So if this is what's going on with autism, let's talk a little bit about treatment. What you're going to find if you do a Google search and look for treatments of autism is that you're going to find there are an abundance of options. And if you dig deeper, you are going to find that very few of them have much of any research support behind them. Now, this can be a controversial area. So where I'd like to start is just to talk a little bit about a study done by the National Autism Center where they did a panel review of 700 plus articles looking at different treatments for autistic disorder. And they took those treatments and the research behind them and broke them down into 4 categories. Established, emerging, unestablished, and ineffective or harmful. So, scientific research reviewed, breaking things down into 4 different categories to look at whether they are effective interventions. Talk first about the effective interventions. They define an effective treatment or an established treatment as those for which several well-controlled studies have shown the intervention to produce beneficial effects. Okay. They also note that even among established treatments, universal improvements cannot be expected to occur for all individuals on the spectrum. There's a little qualifier there that just because we show that this or that treatment is effective for people with autism, your mileage may vary. Established treatments are those that have been shown through research to have beneficial effects. And they came up with several broad categories. And I'll talk about these briefly. Okay. Several of these, I should say, are categorized in broad ways and described as packages because often there are a number of different approaches that fit within the same basic treatment structure, but there may be one or two on a specific type of intervention within that broad treatment structure. So they group them together. So for example, they found that there was a lot of research to support the use of an antecedent package. An antecedent package really represents behavioral treatments that are involved at identifying known antecedents or precursors, the things that cause or are the starting point for behavioral concerns, and either prevent them from occurring or interrupt them. So what does this look like with respect to treatment? Well, give you an example of if I've got somebody that I'm trying to teach something new to, I'm trying to teach them to set a table. They want to work at a restaurant and the restaurant needs people to come out and set the table at the end of a meal after the table's been cleared off. Well, if I come out and I put the plate down on the table and I always, I put the fork to the right, put the fork to the left, and every time somebody comes and corrects me, I get upset. I end up engaging in stereotypies. I can't finish the thing and I'm about to lose my job. Right? What we can do with this, we know that the correction, every time it happens, we have behavioral difficulties. I can't proceed and I can't learn the task. An antecedent package, an example of an antecedent intervention, is to do teaching through what is called errorless learning. What errorless learning does, that's a web searchable term incidentally, what errorless learning does is teaches with steps broken down and presented in a way that I'm not able to make a mistake. Each thing I do is correct. And we'll broaden the steps from there so that I don't need feedback each and every time, but we're going to make sure that it happens so that I never make a mistake setting the table, and then we'll remove the prompts and guides and things like that. Sometimes, and there's a wide variety of ways we do this, which is why it's set up as a package, but it might be that I have a picture of a place setting that I set down, put everything on, slide out from under, set down, put everything on. If that works for me, slide out. You see where I'm going with this? So that I can't make a mistake. Nobody's going to come and tell me that I did it wrong. I can't. I'm following the picture. If that works for me. I might need a jig for that where it's set up and there's a picture in the, there are a number of different ways that we can do it. But if I get upset when people give me corrective feedback, we can remove the corrective feedback, preventing the issue. I learn the job. I keep my job. Okay. Can be as intricate as that and as simple as doing a functional assessment, identifying that every time I'm in a loud room, I have difficulties, and ensuring that I don't have to go into those situations. Okay. Antecedent interventions. Behavioral package, this refers to functional assessment-based interventions of a variety of different sorts or kinds that are going to teach new skills using the techniques of behavior analysis. There's a huge number of things that fall into this category. There's been a lot of research in this area. And I'm a little biased here because I'm also a behavior analyst. But I mean, here we're going to be talking about everything from real basic task analyze skill training, to joint attention training, which is where you're teaching people to recognize specific social cues. Like if I look over here at something in particular, actually directly teaching people to look where I'm looking and understand that that's a cue that you should look there. A lot of folks with autism don't do on their own. Both direct and in-person modeling and video modeling. Naturalistic teaching, there are a lot of things that fall under this package. And you'll hear as I go that we are talking a lot in here about teaching, because that's a big component of this, right? We talk about comprehensive behavioral treatment. That's actually research that looks at this and combines them into a complete grouping so that it's all done at once. Okay. A couple of other examples here. Peer training is doing tutoring using peers as models and instructors of how to behave in specific situations in a very structured way. This is something that is popular for use to some degree in schools, but can be real effective with siblings who are having their own troubles often. If they have a brother or sister on the spectrum, older or younger, coping with the difficulties that go with that, they can actually be a part of the teaching and be an important part of the person's life. And then other things that you'll see a lot of: schedules, self-management, and story-based interventions. Schedules, generally speaking, what we're talking about is visual schedules. These interventions are focused on laying out the day and what's going to happen in the day in a way that makes it much more predictable, removes anxiety from the unexpected components of the day, and helps me better cope with what's going on. So that if I get stuck on, I have to set the table and I have to do that until it's done, but I don't know what comes after that, and I'm afraid of that, I'm worried about that. Well, if I have a visual schedule that clearly outlines for me what's coming next, how long that's going to be, or what's expected there, what you will find is that our folks with autism, the amount of anxiety and behavioral difficulties surrounding those unexpected things goes down considerably. Self-management really is taking things like that and these other taking things like schedules and these other systems and teaching the person to regulate it themselves, which particularly for higher functioning folks with autism can be very effective. And that's really nice because they can take it into adult life and use it there as well. A lot of folks, if you can picture, if I get very focused on specific things that I enjoy to the exclusion of other things, it is not uncommon to find that it is now 4 o'clock in the morning. I have been playing World of Warcraft since 2 in the afternoon. I forgot to eat supper, I forgot to bathe, and I have to be at work at 6. Well, being able to self-manage a schedule so that I get the other things that I actually have to get done to be effective through my day can be a vital skill to have. And then the story-based intervention package, who's heard of social stories? Something you've come across? Okay, that's what they're referring to here. And so what's...
Work for any child, though, with DD, not specifically just on the autism spectrum?
Many of them will. I think the key differences here are, A, we didn't know until the research was done if it would work, and often there are differences in teaching style that needs to be modified specifically for folks with autism. If you're working with somebody who just has a developmental disability, not that that's not a big deal, because it certainly is, but there's a big difference between having a developmental disability where you're otherwise socially intact and interested in the feedback of others and their social approval and so on, and having autism where you may have intellectual and adaptive challenges, plus those basic learning tools, understanding feedback, taking it the right way, reading social signals, reading for social approval, none of it's there. And so what we may have to do, for example, if I'm teaching somebody how to button up their shirt, because that's a challenge for them. Well, if I'm working with somebody who doesn't have autism and is in the, say, the mild to moderate range, when they get a button done, I can say, hey, great job, you know, maybe we'll do a high five, and this may be sufficient for getting us there, and then I can comment on how good they look when they're done, everything's tucked in, and there's all of this positive social feedback that's probably worth working for. If I am working with an adult with autism who has this same issue and needs to learn it, Well, there are a number of potential other challenges. For one thing, if I'm teaching hand over hand, I have to be within very close physical proximity to somebody who may have an intensive need for space. So we have specific techniques that we may use to help mediate that problem. When they get the button done, my person with DD, say Down syndrome, may be excited when I say, hey, great job with that button. For my person with autism, I may say, hey, great job for that button. And they may go, and now I have punished them for buttoning their shirt. It's because the noise, the social, not what they're looking for. So here we may use edibles, we may use other things as rewards. So they're similar, but there are often specific differences in design that we'll use. Excellent question. And yeah, we do use the social skills, not social skills, I'm sorry, social stories and things like that. What these are, for the folks who haven't seen them, are stories that we use where often the person that we're working with takes a central role in the story, uses visuals, uses words, we repeat it over and over, but it explains what to expect and what's expected of them in an upcoming situation. A lot of times, in terms of practice, what we'll use is we'll use schedules to predict regular things throughout the day, and social stories to manage unusual situations. So getting up in the morning, getting ready for work, getting on the bus to get to work, etc. may be a part of my schedule, but the day that I have to go to the dentist, we may need a social story to help with that. Not that you can't do social stories for all the rest of it, because you certainly can, but they are a little bit more time-consuming. All right, the next category I'd like to talk about with respect to the NAC study is things that are considered emerging treatments. And this category refers to treatments for which there have been studies that have positive results, favorable outcomes. However, there's not enough research yet. So here they've gotten some things that suggest that it's emerging or promising, but we don't have enough information to say for sure that these are going to turn out to be effective things. And the important thing to realize about research when we're talking about these things is that you can have some initial positive results and then have things turn out not to be as effective as you thought when you look at it more intensively. Okay? So they are very careful in terms of their description here, because they want to say that you can't be fully confident that these are going to be effective, and we can't rule out that in the future they're going to turn out to be ineffective. Okay? But these are things that people are looking at and are beginning to get some picture of these things maybe being helpful. And we're going to go to the next slide here. You're going to see that there's a lot of them. And this is encouraging because it means that people are looking and trying to find different things that are going to be helpful and effective for them. All right? I'm going to go through a couple of these for you. On the top here is augmentative, and I realize the print is small. I wanted to fit them all on the same page, and they should be on your slides as well. Augmentative and alternative communication devices. So these are things like, this ranges everything from using a picture book to electronic talkers. This is something we see a lot of for children, for adults, and everywhere in between. So it's in practice quite a bit. The thing that's interesting about it in terms of this study is, although these different interventions are used quite a bit, we don't know a lot about how well they work. Okay? So there are other things that fall in this same category. Sign language, used specifically for the purpose of communication, is considered emerging. The PECS system, folks familiar with PECS, Picture Exchange Communication System? This is similar to communication books, but it actually involves trading specific pictures for things that you want, and ultimately getting to the point where you can build sentences to indicate the things that you want. The folks at Pyramid Consulting who have designed and teach the PECS system say that they've had very good results out of it, but in terms of good structured research, that's still developing. And some of these things are things we spend quite a bit of time on. So it's interesting to see how they stack up in terms of the amount of research. A couple of other things on here. Cognitive behavioral interventions. These are therapies based around the basic concepts of cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay? Those have been, thank you, those have been investigated considerably for typically functioning adults for treatments of things like anxiety disorders and depression. So you would think that it might have some utility here as well, but we haven't done a ton of research on it, but we have some initially promising results. We do a lot of work with social skills training. And there are a lot of different components that are designed around teaching specific social skills. But that's still an emerging treatment. Music therapy is on here. Theory of mind training, which is trying to teach folks with autism to take the perspective of other people. Something that, we have, as typically functioning folks, we have some ability to understand what other people are thinking by the look on their face, by the way they're holding themselves and talking and so on. It's trying to teach those skills as well. So there are a lot of things here, many of which are in common use, but when they do a structured look at the research supporting them, are still in the emerging category. We don't fully know whether these are going to work or not. Might be all right to work on them if they're what we have available and we don't have other things available for the person at the moment, but we're still learning about whether or not they work. One of the things about this that is interesting is, to me, is that the size of the list suggests that we have a lot of investigation in what will work, which is promising, but we still have quite a bit of work to do. Any questions about any of these?
What's the peer-mediated? Very bottom, peer-mediated instruction.
I had to look that one up. I have it. This is teaching basic academic skills with peers. So if you're working on reading, spelling, things like that, having the kids do the teaching, the other kids in the classroom. This is different than the peer intervention package because that's using much more structured things, not based around academic instruction, but more around social skills and other more specific component skills. Reductive package here, that one bears a little bit of description as well. This is use of behavioral intervention techniques specifically focused on punishment, as opposed to functional analysis-based behavioral interventions that teach new skills. So this is just punishing for inappropriate things as opposed to teaching new skills as a part of behavioral treatment. This is something that actually parents do quite a bit just by nature. But we're not clear yet whether that's effective on its own. Yes?
I have a question. It's regarding, I've heard of like a specialty schools, one in Evanston, North Carolina. They use a program called, I think it is Teach. Where does that fit?
Structured teaching is Teach. It is an emerging behavior, emerging treatment. And I will say something about that. That's a good question. And Teach and structured teaching is a package approach. So it has a lot of different components, some of which are very much based in the behavioral package that we talked about as an established treatment, others which are not. So this is evaluating, which are more, the other components are more philosophical, but they include, if you're doing Teach, you're doing it all together. That's part of why it falls under here, because not everything they're talking about as a part of that package is a part of an established treatment. I actually do use a Teach model, particularly for classrooms, especially if the classrooms are not well organized. If you have a special education classroom that is chaotic, well, it's very hard to figure out where to start until you get that organized, and that package provides you something that the teacher can learn very quickly out of the box to give you room to work. But in terms of everything that it claims and the whole component of it, that would still be considered emerging. It's a good question. We had another question over here. Yes?
For music therapy, is that just to like self-soothe?
No. What they're referring to when they talk about music therapy here is use of music as a component of teaching. Let me find that here, just so that I'm telling you the right thing. There are enough different interventions that my list is not very good, where you are using music to help structure a task or activity. So, well, a real basic example would be like using the song "This is the Way We Wash Our Clothes" and inserting the different steps of the task into that so that you have sort of a musical door into how to put this activity or task together, which is, and so that's a big component of it. So it's different than just a soothing part of it. Yeah. I'm sorry, no, go ahead.
So what would it be like if, you know, I work at an X-ray on the weekends, and so a lot of them have their headphones on and they've got their iPod and, you know what I mean? And is that to like reduce unwanted noise on the outside?
Yes, that would be, I mean, in most cases, that's what I would expect, is there you have somebody blocking out input that they can't manage. So they know what's coming through the headphones, they know what the volume is, they know what to expect, decreases anxiety.
What about the technology?
Go ahead.
The technology-based treatment?
Technology-based treatment is really looking at a variety of different teaching structures based on computer use. So there are some thoughts where you're looking at folks may, because they have the social mediation problems, may do better if they're instructed through use of a computer. It's an interesting hypothesis. It may be effective, and we're still seeing research on it. Now, okay, reductive package is looking at behavioral interventions using punishment or aversive stimuli alone. So typically when we design a behavior treatment plan, what we want to do is identify what the maladaptive behavior is for, teach a better way to get that. Sometimes we use reductive techniques if the existing behavior is really established and hard to get rid of. We do have to get rid of that, and so we'll use this. Well, this is taking all of that teaching and training out and just doing the punishment. Typically we don't recommend, but people have looked at it, and it's an emerging technique. Okay? All very good questions. All right. And let's talk about unestablished treatments. Okay? These are those for which there is little or no evidence in the scientific literature to let them draw a firm conclusion. So there's no reason to assume the things that we're going to be talking about are effective, and no way to rule out the possibility that they're ineffective. Okay? Key to understanding this, as we talk about these things, are also that we are looking at the things that some research has been done on. This is a very short list. This is what the National Center, Autism Center found. We talk about academic interventions here. What we are talking about is traditional teaching techniques. So the things that a teacher is trained in to get performance in the classroom applied to kids with autism. There hasn't been any good research to show that this is a useful teaching approach for children or adults with autism. Okay? Auditory integration training is referring to use of headphones differently than the way that we're talking about where you're just playing your own music, but using different tones and sounds and things like that to help retain a measure of calm and better focus on the environment. Okay. Facilitated communication, are folks familiar with this and what this is? It was very popular for a short period of time. But it's been several years. Facilitated communication is different than the communication teaching techniques that we were talking about before. This focuses on assisting the person to communicate through use of a facilitator. So you have a keyboard on a computer, for example, and the facilitator moves the person's hand through the keyboard to communicate. Research on this has been done. It's unestablished because it hasn't come out with positive results. And when they do real solid structured research, the effect that comes out is that primarily when you are doing facilitated communication, you are talking to the facilitator, not to the person that they're facilitating for. Okay. Gluten and casein-free diet, or GFCF diet, is on here. Is this something you've heard of? Okay, this is a very complicated and sometimes expensive dietary approach. Some early studies suggested it was promising. Later, more intensive work has not borne out those outcomes. And then the sensory integration package is here as well. Okay. Now, unestablished means that we simply don't have research that shows that these things are effective. However, the report actually refers specifically to facilitated communication and gluten and casein-free diets by noting that there are studies that show that there can be some harmful effects from the GFCF diet. I'd refer you to that. And facilitated communication, other organizations have actually advised specifically against being concerned that there may be some restriction to the rights of the person being communicated for because they are not represented in that communication. This one, when you get out into other components, it can be particularly problematic because depending on the situation, the facilitator may not recognize that they're communicating their own components. Anybody ever used a Ouija board? Feels like your hand's moving on its own, the spirits are guiding it. This seems to work on much the same principle. So you may not know when you are the one moving it around, just like you don't really realize that this is what's happening with the board. Okay. Then that last category is ineffective or harmful treatments. So these are those for which several well-controlled studies have shown the intervention to be ineffective or produce harmful outcomes. They didn't find any. Now, what's important to realize about this is that they didn't find any because researchers tend, if they are finding their research to be ineffective, they tend to stop their well-controlled study because they're not going to get outcomes, and why would you proceed? Nobody's going to publish it for you. And similarly, if you are doing a study on an intervention, you are a researcher there trying to develop something that will help people, and it is harmful in the study, you're going to stop. All right? So mostly what this tells us is that people who do good research are doing what they're supposed to and stopping if they find something ineffective or harmful. Yes? Well, this is the thing. That's an excellent point. You are going to find, as you dig through, if you do an internet search for treatments for autism, you are going to find a huge array of things that aren't on this list. This list covers those things for which there have been some type of research studies. What does that tell you about the hyperbaric chambers? Right. Now, my purpose here is not to give you my opinion of which way you should go on these things. So, what I would encourage you to do with that is to use, and again there's a link at the end in terms of finding this report and this information, to use this as a backdrop towards evaluating the different things that you may want to use when you're working with folks who have autism, because there are going to be a lot of additional options, and if it's not on that list, it means folks haven't evaluated them. Also, even if it's not on the ineffective or harmful list, it doesn't mean that they're not one or both. It simply means that nobody looked at it and found that. Okay? Does everybody know about the hyperbaric oxygen chambers, what she's referring to? Okay? These are big metal tubes that fit a person. Right? And they were originally designed, to my understanding, for treatment of the bends, which is a condition that scuba divers get if they come to the surface too quickly. Nitrogen bubbles in the bloodstream. It's very painful, causes you to double over, hence the bends. Right? You put them in the chamber, you adjust the pressure in the chamber and slowly decrease it to alleviate this condition. I believe it's also used to some degree for wound care. I don't know what the research is to support that. Okay? They're large, mechanical devices. They're very expensive. And what you have is a market of people looking for other applications. And there is an entire large group of people who believe that use of oxygen exposure in a hyperbaric chamber may be helpful for, well, a variety of conditions, including autism. There are a couple of other things that fall into these areas that I can mention really briefly. And there's actually a lady who has been doing a series of journalistic articles for the Chicago Tribune. Her name is Trine Sidoris. Sidoris is T-S-O-U-R-I-S. A-D-I-S, I think, or O-S, on autism treatments. And she's done a very nice job. For example, last fall there was a duo that went through the Chicago area, and they have clinics across the country doing Lupron therapy for children with autism. Lupron is a chemical that, well, it changes testosterone levels. It is functionally chemical castration. Its primary use is, or one of its primary use is for the chemical castration of prisoners who are sex offenders. But it can also be used in the treatment of precocious puberty, which is the development of secondary sexual characteristics, primarily body hair, but other things as well, in children that are too young to have gone through puberty yet. They do a series of 50-some blood tests, and if your child, your son or daughter, primarily your son, shows their testosterone to be off on any of those blood tests, they diagnose you with precocious puberty and treat your child with Lupron. That's not on here either. So there are a lot of things like that that have to be, when you come across those things, I would look on this list and say, okay, is it here? If it's not, why not? Yes?
I don't see anything about medication anywhere in any of the lists.
We're going to talk about that. It's not because, well, A, medication therapies weren't seen here as something that they investigated, not even in the ineffective and harmful areas. And the type of research study, I will go so far as to say the type of research studies that they're looking at are different than what they'll do a lot for medication. A lot of use of medication in mental health is off-label. And so it comes out of case study and consensus building, which wouldn't fit the criteria that they're talking about here, but it's certainly commonly used. Okay? But there is no medication that actually has an indication for treatment of autism at this time. All right? Okay. Well, all that said, I want to leave you today with some information on kind of what treatment does look like. Okay, so here's the different things that we can look at as options. In terms of overall what a treatment package might look like for a person with autism, we're going to look at 4 different areas as being important. First, we want to have an interdisciplinary approach. This is a pervasive disorder. It's going to affect the person throughout every aspect of their lives most of the time. And so we need people from those different aspects and different areas of expertise involved in their treatment. Okay? We're going to talk about that. We use a lot of adaptations and accommodations. That's going to fall into that antecedent package that we talked about. And the bulk of the treatment that we will be doing when we do treatment for folks with autism is going to center around skill building. However, we also run into behavioral and mental health concerns, and there we also have to do some symptom management. I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. Real briefly, when I talk about an interdisciplinary approach, there's a wide group of people that I think need to be involved. Okay? We need folks from the schools. If the person is in school, we need their physicians to be involved in treatment and understand what an overall treatment plan is. Occupational therapists, physical therapy, speech therapy are often important components. Behavior analysts can be extremely important components, and parents, family, and loved ones. These all should be a part of the treatment team with some variation from person to person, but if you're shy many of these components, it's going to be difficult to put together effective treatment. Going to be missing bits of the puzzle. When I say adaptation and accommodation, I'm referring to a number of different things. Okay? We've talked about several of these, but I'll talk about them more generally. What we're going to want to do when we design treatment is we're going to want to understand that there are situations and scenarios where we're going to have to adjust and accommodate. Okay, we have to pick our battles. So if I have somebody, for example, who has severe sensory issues where they just have lots of trouble dealing with noise, well, it looks very different to wear those hunter earmuffs. Everybody's going to notice that you're doing it. But if that allows you to get through your day, that may open the door for us to do other things. That may be a reasonable adaptation, especially if you don't mind how you look and what's going on. Now, it's nice if you can do an adjustment like the headphones, where that's much more normal, much more typical. We see people wearing headphones quite a bit, right? If you're working with somebody who just has tons of difficulty with tags in their clothing, right, it's probably a lot less work just to go through and remove the tags than it is to spend days and hours trying to teach the person to adjust to the tags in the clothes. Okay? So we will make a number of sensory adaptations in order to address this. If you've got somebody who has difficulty eating foods of a specific texture, a food processor may be your friend. Almost anything can be blended into a largely textureless slurry if that's really your goal. It's not appetizing to look at, but it can be done. And that may be something that you need to do if you're having difficulty getting sufficient nutrition, and it may be the simplest route to addressing that issue over the short term. Okay? In terms of adaptation and accommodation, a lot of the visual schedules and scheduling systems that we use fall into this category because they're a way to help the person prepare for and adjust to what's going on with their lives. What's coming, what to expect, and so on. These are often integral parts of treatment plans. Now, these can actually become also skill-building components, but particularly when we start, they really are an adaptation. There's something that we wouldn't do for everybody, but we're going to add in for this person, and they definitely come ahead of the rest of the difficulties. Of a similar category are previewing and preparation statements. What this is getting into the habit of letting the person know in advance what's coming. So that can be done with the visual schedules, but often it also involves things like coming up to somebody and saying, you know, in 20 minutes we're going to be stopping. Okay? Just wanted to let you know. And then we're going to go on and we're going to go have lunch. We're going to leave the building and we're going to have lunch. So she knows that's coming now. It will be less anxiety producing. And if she has a lot of trouble with changes and adjustments, I may come back in 5 minutes and in 10 and in 15 before the change comes. Because if I have difficulty transitioning from one activity to the next, I've now begun my transition a half an hour of when it's likely to happen. Now, that's an accommodation because you do not do this for everybody. You don't say to your friends a half an hour to 45 minutes before the end of the meal that the meal will be ending. They don't need this notification, right? But it may be extremely useful if your friend has severe autism. May make the end of that meal go much, much better. Okay? Another thing that we'll do here in terms of adaptation and accommodation is identify and avoid problem areas. And you'll see this more often than you would expect, where a staff person, for example, will come in and say, well, Billy really loves country music. So we took him to the concert at the fairgrounds on Friday. And he just had an awful time. He was out of control. He was screaming. He was yelling. He was hitting himself. How can we get him to manage that trip to the fairground? Maybe Billy shouldn't be going to the fairground. Maybe he'd rather listen to country music in his room. Right? If we have reliable outcomes like that, identifying them and not putting ourselves in the position of encountering those difficulties can be very helpful. Sometimes people will think of this as, well, then we're limiting Billy's life. Well, Billy's telling you what he thinks about that fairground and that activity. He's giving you some signal about how he feels about that, and left to his own devices probably wouldn't go anyway. The key to a lot of these accommodation techniques is that we're going to pick our battles. We're going to use these to address some symptoms while we deal with others. So we cannot go to the fairgrounds for a while if it gives us time to do other things, for example. And what we're doing with that primarily is getting us to a situation where we've set the stage to do skill building. And the overwhelming majority of the treatments on the other, when we talked about the National Autism Center's results, really focus on skill building. When folks come in, staff, parents, caregivers come in, they're going to want to tell you about what's been going wrong and want to know what to do in response to what's going wrong. Okay, when I change the channel on the TV before the credits have rolled, he gets out of control. What do I do then? But you're going to find, as you go through the literature, that the bulk of the work is best done and is most effective working up front, developing skills, antecedent interventions, and skills so that those behavioral episodes don't happen in the first place. Okay? The frontline treatment right now in terms of research are skill training and building through the techniques of applied behavior analysis. And with applied behavior analysis based skill training, we can teach everything from basic living skills, dressing, shoe tying, to cooking, to educational and vocational skills, social skills, and even basic and alternative communication skills. The core feature to this approach is that you're breaking skills down into their component parts, teaching those component parts with appropriate motivators identified specifically to the person's needs, and then putting that task together so that it's a complete skill. Okay? It's probably pretty easy to picture because that's what you do when you teach a kid, for example, how to tie their shoes and things like that for basic living skills. But even things like a social interaction have very specific components. When you walk up to somebody, you stop a prescribed distance away. There's something you look at them. There's something you say when you first walk up. These are all understood and can be broken down and taught very effectively for people so that we can take those skills and then put them together in a way that works for the person to get what they need. If I can't ever talk to somebody so that nobody ever wants to interact with me, we can break this skill down to make that much more effective for you. Okay? And there is even work being done with teaching folks who have no auditory skills to begin to use language to communicate. Now, a lot of these things really are centered around identifying what the person is interested in working for, because we learn these things on our own as children based on the social approval of parents and family. These folks don't, because often that's not interesting to them. So we have to find other reasons to learn it. Like, if you have somebody like Sheldon learning how to approach somebody and say, hello, my name is so-and-so, and I would like this, being unable to do that may be the barrier to getting the right comic book at the right time. If you can't talk to the guy at the comic book store and all of the ones you want are behind the counter, Sheldon might be willing to learn that skill for that purpose. Okay? He would probably make his own algorithm to teach him how to do that. Okay? But these things can be taught in this way. There are other folks that work in this area too, and a lot of it is complementary. Okay? Occupational therapy does work in terms of building fine motor skills, and I'm not an occupational therapist, so if any of you are, correct and build on this as you see appropriate. I've worked with folks who have been very helpful in terms of designing and modifying equipment and developing adaptations so that we can get skills taught. And there's a lot of skill set with these folks with respect to basic daily living skills and programming as well. And when we get down to language and communication, speech therapy can have an integral role as well. Okay, for building communication skills and both for developing both verbal and alternative communication skills. And that last area that we want to talk about here briefly is symptom management. And there are a number of different ways to go into that. When I talk about symptom management here, what I'm talking about is addressing behavioral excesses that are a problem and interfering with the rest of what we're trying to do. Right? So if I have somebody who spends their entire day spinning a can in the corner, and I cannot get my foot in the door to get them to even begin to try anything I have to offer to teach, I may need to go and do some symptom management to address that behavioral issue so that we can do the rest of what we need to do. Does that make sense? And this is where these different interventions come in. Okay? We have a handful of options here. Functional assessment-based behavioral treatment is a very broad category, and I described that a little bit ago. This is where we're doing assessments and identifying the function of a behavior and teaching other ways to achieve that same outcome. And sometimes that does involve using corrective techniques to decrease the occurrence of the other behavior as well. Okay? So this is different than just that skill training because we're actually going to be focused on reducing specific maladaptive behaviors. An emerging therapy that may be effective for folks who are higher functioning is cognitive behavioral therapy along much the same lines. But I want to be clear, that's emerging. And you do have to have some pretty good basic communication skills, particularly language skills, to do this. But it may be effective as well. And also, this is the point at which we would look at the potential use of psychiatric symptom management. And in terms of medication involvement, here what you're going to see is psychiatry focused on what the symptoms look like and what we know helps with those specific things. So, I'm not a psychiatrist. When I work with psychiatrists on these things, if we have folks who, for example, spend a lot of time engaged in ritualistic activities, they may look at that in terms of its similarity, for example, to OCD and manage treatments around that. What we do when we do this is we keep very clear definitions of what we're trying to treat, excuse me, and we keep track of how much those behaviors are happening. We do this because in my clinical experience, the response that folks with autism have to psychiatric treatment is often somewhat different than we expect. So I've worked with kids who parents gave them Benadryl to help them sleep at night, and they were up for 4 days subsequent to taking the Benadryl. Right? I've worked with folks whose ritualistic behavior got worse after taking Prozac, for example, instead of better. And I've worked with folks who have responded exactly as you would expect. But because they have such idiosyncratic responses, we define what we're trying to treat, and we keep track of it in very objective terms so we know how they're responding. Sure.
Here, but what I'm looking for are for those of us resources, special resources, in doing these assessments for the issue and then making treatment recommendations. We say, like, a list of those. I've heard that the University of Illinois has a good that works with children with autism. Children's Memorial, I know that they have some good assessment tools for sensory, but I'm not sure if they do for autism. So is there a list of resources out there?
There are a couple of organizations that I'd steer you towards. Those are very good questions. A lot of the research that we're talking about with respect to the different treatments, including a much more in-depth report on what they mean, that was all done through the National Autism Center. So that'll give you a much more detailed picture of what's going on. Within the state of Illinois, there is a state-funded program called the Autism Program. This is an organization that now they're all, because the state is having all sorts of funding issues, there's all sorts of questions about the future of it. However, right now it exists and it has regional offices across the state. What's offered at different settings is different from one location to another. The University of Chicago is one of them. And what they will do, depending on the site, is everything from basic materials like lending libraries, put together social skills book, put together visual schedules. I work with the one in Rockford. We do family focus consultations where we work with families to help them get that initial treatment, those initial treatment materials together, the visual schedules and things like that, and how to use them. They will run trainings through those, and at some of the sites we also do evaluations. And those will give you the we will do the ADOS and the intellectual assessments and all of that to give a complete picture on what's going on with the child. In most cases, or the adult, and in most cases, what we will be doing with respect to that, the programs maintain information and resource lists as well. And they're going to be regionally cited so that they have an idea of what's around you. They're an excellent resource. A lot of them maintain lending libraries for autism materials as well. And they're not geared just at parents. It's meant to cover anybody who needs the assistance. That was good. Another resource here is going to be the Behavior Analysis Certification Board, and I have the link here for that. As I mentioned, I'm a board-certified behavior analyst. These are the folks that are going to design those ABA therapies for you. They maintain a register of folks, and you can search based on a specific radius from your zip code or your location to find out who's available in the area and what they're doing. So it's an excellent resource for that. Okay, and then these others are the links for the studies that we talked about. Other questions? I guess I wouldn't be self-serving enough if I didn't also point out that we do maintain information at our website as well. That's a resource also. All right. Thanks very much, folks.